One of the most striking adaptations in animals is perhaps the long neck and the long legs of giraffes. And this has been historically, was a contentious discussion of how exactly this evolution from presumably a short-limbed and short-necked ancestor to a long-necked and long-limbed extant giraffe happened. And this is exemplified by Lamarck's concept, which was that evolution didn't happen by random mutations and natural selection like Darwinian evolution, but rather simply that need drove the adaptation that perhaps, for example, the short-necked ancestor ate a lot of low branches on trees, and that left only higher branches for subsequent generations. And so every additional generation, that giraffe needed to stretch a little bit higher to reach the food, and a little bit higher and a little bit higher, and that somehow those physical changes to individuals would somehow pass from that individual to their descendants. And of course, we know that that's not true, because the only traits that pass from the ancestor to the descendant are those that are mutations in their germ cells, their sperm and egg, that produce the following generation. So it's not a physical trait that passes from generation to generation, but the DNA in their germline and changes to the DNA sequences only in the germ cells. Nevertheless, it's still a really interesting question how exactly these extreme traits evolved in giraffes. So what we're going to look at is the process of looking for signatures of positive selection, that is diversifying selection, or genes that underwent change, specifically in the giraffe lineage. So we see here a simple phylogeny of species that include the genus Giraffe, which contains 4 different giraffe species. And these are members of the family Giraffidae. And these are in the order Artiodactyla, which includes as more distant relatives hippopotami, pigs, sheep, cattle, and moose. So the question is, what is the best species to compare giraffe to understand what drove the evolution of those extreme traits, specifically in giraffes, and not in the next most closely related species that doesn't exhibit those extreme traits? And that's members of the genus Okapia, the okapi. And even though they look like they might be related to zebras, they're actually not. The genus Equus, which contains horses and zebras, is in a different order, Perissodactyla. So these are actually more distantly related to the okapi than hippopotami, pigs, and sheep. And giraffes and the okapi are actually pretty closely related. They're in different genera, but they are in the same family. So this is the species that's useful to compare giraffes to the okapi, which, as you just saw, doesn't have a really long neck, doesn't have the really long legs. So those DNA mutations that are unique to giraffes that give them those extreme traits must have arisen since the okapi and the giraffes last shared a common ancestor. There are a few other interesting things about giraffes that we're going to talk about. Now, commonly, they are ruminant mammals, and they're related to cattle. They tend to live very short lives, about 10 to 15 years in the wild. Interestingly, they sleep only something like 10 to 20 minutes a day. They also tend to eat plants that contain, in nature, that contain toxins and other psychoactive substances, and also high amounts of calcium and proteins. And these are from trees like acacia trees and other genera like the genus that contains the myrrh plant. So those are additional traits that we could be interested in studying in addition to long limbs and the long neck, is how do giraffes deal with short amounts of sleep and also digesting and not dying from eating these toxic compounds. In addition, aside from just having a long neck, there are 2 other potential problems with having that long neck that must have been solved through evolution as the giraffe's neck lengthened. One is their heart has to be much more powerful to pump blood all the way up their neck to get to their brain. The other thing is, when giraffes bend over to drink, all the blood would pool in their head and they would pass out if they don't have a way to prevent that. So there's a valve system in the blood vessels in the neck that prevent the blood from rushing to the head so that they don't pass out when they drink. Finally, their legs, those really long legs, have to hold up this entire huge body mass, and they also have to maintain good arterial pressure for the same reason. So those are all things that these authors are going to look for signatures of to try to explain how those traits evolved. And what I'd like you to do is to focus on two main questions when you first read the manuscript. What is the hypothesis? Is there a hypothesis, and what is it? And what experiments did the scientists perform to test their hypothesis?